This episode was made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to episode 158 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book
And then see the movie.
I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss Alan Moore and David Lloyd's 1982 comic, V for Vendetta. So we're back with another Alan Moore comic. This is a really political one, which we thought would be a fun one to choose for this time in America, where we're leading up to our election. I don't know if you're listening to this at a later date or as it comes out. We are right around the election time here, and we don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of uncertainty. So some of this stuff could seem like maybe overblown. Some of it could seem like maybe we're underselling just how dark things are about to get. But we thought V for Vendetta would be a fun one to cover, considering all of that.
Yeah, you can also consider this our Halloween coverage, because
that's right.
Happy it's coming Halloween. Out the week of Halloween. You know, I love Halloween, but, you know, given the current state of things, it's unfortunate that we don't get to have Halloween parties and see everybody all dressed up. And yeah, we have the election looming. So very interesting time right now. Stressful. I'm stressed out. Hopefully it all works out.
Right. And so the other thing to say about this is, like, clearly V for Vendetta is incredibly British. And it is a lot to do with, like, British politics. And it was written in the 80s. So here we are covering it decades later. So a lot of this stuff, like, only loosely applies to what's going on today. And plus we're, like, taking it from British politics and thinking about it in American sensibilities. And we're going to get some stuff wrong. We're going to get some references wrong. It was written as a response to the Margaret Thatcher administration and Thatcherism, which we touched on a little bit when we, in a bonus episode, covered a Michael Moorcock essay in response to J.R.R. Tolkien called Epic Pooh. Anyway, one of the things he touched on was that he felt like Tolkien and Lord of the Rings sort of embodied Thatcherism, which I thought was interesting to see this term come up again here, where Alan Moore is writing in response to Thatcherism. And it's this conservative movement of the time in British politics that apparently a lot of people are reacting to very strongly. I'm not very familiar with it, since it was before I was born and in another country.
It is very interesting that we can take the subject matter of this story that's very inherently British and reacting to things in Britain. And obviously there are things being said about fascist regimes and I think it's always going to be timely as long as there's fascism. And so to see sort of some of the parallels it kind of makes it a timeless story and a cautionary tale for any age, and just the idea of becoming complacent or you know, a government sort of starting to have propaganda and influence citizens into sort of just living comfortable lives. And I don't know, I think it's really interesting to see that, like, this sort of stuff kind of, it transcends one country and one certain political time and movement.
You're right. Like, through the lens of time, I feel like this story takes on almost more of an allegory kind of tone to it. Like, it's almost detached from politics of any given time, and it's more about what to do in a fascist police state and how you can combat that. And in that sense, I found it really, really interesting, because it is a deeper exploration of anarchy and anarchism as, like, almost a political movement or a political idea than anything I've really read before. I've always been aware of, like, anarchists who even, like, self-identify that way and say, like, I'm an anarchist. And, like, I don't think I really understood what was meant by that. And I'm not saying that this speaks for everyone, but in a way, this sort of outlined the idea of anarchy and how it can combat a fascist regime. in a way that I found really interesting. It's not saying like I 100% agreed with everything, you know. I think there is a lot of moral gray areas that go on in this book.
You know, clearly there's a one-sided side to the story, and there's clearly people who are corrupt and people who are trying to do the right thing. But even the people who are doing the right thing tend to do things that are in gray areas. Like you said, like V isn't a person you should look to as somebody who is the authority on justice or anything like that. But I think it's showing that like it takes someone like V sometimes to sort of like spur a movement or to get people thinking in certain frames of reference. And I think anarchy in itself is a great idea, but the problem becomes it, as we see in the story, it sort of crumbles down and then things have to be rebuilt. It's not the end game. It's sort of the thing that you do to combat censorship and to combat being suppressed by a government, something like that.
Yeah, oppression, yeah. I think you touched on something that was important, that is a piece of the anarchist ideal that I didn't really fully understand, and that was, at least to here, it's presented as a two-part process. Like the first part is destroy and crumble the forces of oppression in the government, and then the second part is rebuild something new. And what's interesting is that rebuild something new is always sort of put off to a later date. You know, it's like, right. It's like, yeah, we'll figure out what the new thing looks like eventually. And that's one of the things that always seems incomplete to me about the idea is like, yeah, sure, break it all down, but like rebuild it with what? And what is going to work? What is not going to lend itself to these same sort of problems, but yet still provide all of the, in my opinion, necessary social contracts and safety nets that need to be in place, and structures that need to be in place for society to work in a way and to be successful. And obviously, many people will disagree about what those things are. And I think it knows that. So instead of like dealing with it, it's like, yeah, we'll figure that out and we can come to an agreement. But that is very important. And I think it's something that I still see a lot of debate about, like what do we need to actually do? And I don't want to bog down our podcast with our personal opinions on some of this stuff. So I'll just say that I have feelings about certain things, but I don't know that they're right. And I constantly am like taking in new information about like what is necessary, what, you know, specifically like policing, criminal justice, stuff like that. Like what of that is something that should be present in a society versus what of that is inherently oppressive. And right. I think there's a big spectrum there, right? Of like what you think and what people believe is needed and what people believe is not needed. And I don't know where I fit. I know that I have moved around some this year in particular, from like things that I used to believe. So I don't know that this book provides any answers.
Right.
That's not really what it's about. This book is more about like how to challenge oppressive police states that are clearly in the wrong and clearly doing bad shit.
Right. And that's what the story, anything that can be created in the eyes of the anarchists has to be better than what's actively going on. That's the point of anarchy, is like this has to fall for something else to come along, and anything's going to be better than this, so it's time for anarchy.
And just so we're clear, we're talking about a fictional book here, not outlining like specific things that need to happen in our country. So if any of this sounds like we're advocating certain things to happen, that's all just subtextual, and you're bringing it to this. We're not saying that this needs to happen in our country. We're just talking about V for Vendetta. You know what I mean? Yeah. Oh, I got something in my eye.
So I don't know about you, but I've read this comic run before, and then I've also seen the movie. But being a younger person and not maybe living through some of the stuff we've now lived through, when I first read the story, I felt like it was sort of almost like edgelord, like wish fulfillment sort of anarchy that was going on in the story. And I felt like there was a lot to the story that was kind of just people wanting to be extreme for the sake of being extreme.
Man, that's so important to point out, right? Like the current political environment you live in and how comfortable you are in it will affect the way you view this story. Like right now is the perfect time for me to read this, where I feel like America has gone to the precipice of full-blown fascism and maybe over the edge. I think time will tell in the next couple weeks, and next few months where we're at with this. And in this moment, this book really, really speaks to me.
Right.
But I agree. Like back in the day when I watched the movie and stuff, it felt like kind of an extreme reaction. Now, obviously, I was in a certain bubble of privilege there, right, that I recognize way more now than I ever did before. But yeah, I mean, it can seem kind of edgelordy when you first check it out because you're like, really? We're going to blow up Parliament? Okay. But yeah, right now it's like, yeah, maybe something needs to be blown up. I don't know. Theoretically. In the fictional world.
I think, I think I just didn't have the history to back up sort of, and or maybe the empathy to have seen all of the atrocities that have gone on in different countries and things like that because of that bubble that we were in. And so, yeah, this story right now is just very, like I said, it's timely and it's kind of transcending whether it's a British story or an American story.
Well, all that being said, let me give a little bit of a summary of like what V for Vendetta is. But then we decided, we kind of discussed it, and like there's so much that happens in this book because it is comprising many, many different issues of comics that came out as a serialized thing. Each one having their own little arcs and their own little, and there's like many, many characters. So rather than getting bogged down in summary, and it's something that's a little bit unusual for us, we're really not going to do that. We're going to still talk about it because it's divided into 3 books, book 1, book 2, book 3, but we're not going to summarize them. What we'll instead do is just talk about them, and we recommend, I would recommend people go read this, especially right now. I think this is a really interesting piece. It varies greatly from the movie. We're going to get into the movie next week, and we'll probably outline more of the differences, but this book, much like the Watchmen comic that we covered before, like it's really different than the movie adaptation that we get. And so in that sense, like I would say like, even if you've seen the movie, don't feel like you know what goes on in this comic because it's very different. And it's worth checking out with the caveat of it was written in the 80s, and in some ways that shows, and especially in the way it depicts women and certain things. It's like, I don't know. I'm not saying it's like perfectly woke or anything like that. It's really not. But it's still worth checking out, in my opinion.
I also was reading that Alan Moore himself was quoted as saying that there was a period where he could have gone back to sort of change some of the things that he wrote in these early stories because as time went, he said he was a young author, a young writer when he first started working on these stories. So, by the end of the run, he felt like he could have gone back to change some of it to sort of have more impact or to sort of, I don't know if he would have made some of the characters more woke or anything like that. Like what
I don't
he
think
specifically
so. I know what quote you're talking about, and I think he's specifically talking about like the setup of the world where nuclear winter happens for much of the world, but like Britain can remain somewhat unaffected. And I think he's specifically talking about how like
scientifically
later on he scientifically read that like that couldn't happen. That like,
gotcha.
You know what I mean? So I don't know that I think he's pretty comfortable with the way he writes, whether or not we are. I think, and readers are. I think is going to vary from person to person. We've talked about Alan Moore in our Watchmen coverage a little bit. He's a controversial figure in some ways, but also like one of the biggest, most respected names in all of comics, right? Like he's just huge. And like after reading Watchmen and reading V for Vendetta, I can just tell that like anything I pick up from him is going to be entertaining, going to be interesting, it's a mind that clearly has a lot to say and is going to say it in an incredibly unique way. And like, that's what I want, from fiction. So, I was excited to see him work with a different artist here. And it makes for a different piece. And I don't know. I guess just all that to say that like I would love to read some more Alan Moore. I know League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is one that apparently he wrote. That did you know that that's the adaptation that like broke him? Apparently,
I heard
like he hated it so much that he like swore off of all adaptations at that point. And that's why like he distanced himself from this adaptation and Watchmen.
He refused to have his name attached to any of the like his name wouldn't be on any of the marketing materials, any of the sort of like.
When it's funny because like I saw that movie and I thought it was bad. Like I did not like the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, the film. But man, I would be interested in reading an Alan Moore comic now that I know who Alan Moore is and like his style and stuff. I'm like, man, actually that comic might be really good.
He super unique voice. hugely influential in the industry and in comics, and like changed, I think definitely changed the course of comics. And then he has a super famous run of the Swamp Thing. He has just all kinds of stuff all kinds of stuff that the Killing Joke is like one that everyone loves to go to. Very hugely influential. So I would like to continue to read more Alan Moore as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And other comics, actually. This is just another reminder of like how fun it is to cover like a graphic novel. It's a lot, like a lot goes down in here, but it was really fun, and it's nice. We covered The Old Guard recently, which was really cool, like a data point for me too, seeing like a something that came out in the 80s versus something that's coming out today, and like how stylistically different they were. I mean, hugely different. And I just, again, like tip the iceberg stuff for me, because I'm very new to comics, and I could tell like this is just a massive medium that has a lot going on. And you could devote your whole life to this and, still be just like learning more and like seeing different voices and different things being brought into it. And I'm excited to get in, but I do feel a little bit like I've fallen in the deep end here. And I'm like,
I've read tons of comics, and I still feel like it's a drop in the bucket. You know what I mean? I definitely don't consider myself an expert or anything close to it. And I love just like the medium, the fact that it's visual and sort of written word. You can take your time, you can stop to analyze the art and see exactly the motion of what's going on, and like intentions of the author, intentions of the other author, which would be David Lloyd in this case. So it's such a fascinating medium, and I love exploring it.
Well, that visual element too, it really feels almost like a stepping stone, or this interesting sort of link between pure prose and a film. You know what I mean? Like there's this interesting in between area that is really cool.
Yeah, and they're still using sort of cinematic language too in the way that they frame their shots. It's like a storyboard. It's like a storyboard for a film, but even more sort of honed, I would say.
Yeah, really cool. Okay, so V for Vendetta is a British graphic novel written by Alan Moore and illustrated by David Lloyd, with additional art by Tony Weir. Initially published starting in 1982 in black and white as an ongoing serial in the short-lived UK anthology Warrior, it morphed into a 10-issue limited series published by DC Comics. Subsequent collected editions have typically been published under DC's more specialized imprint Vertigo. The story depicts a dystopian and post-apocalyptic near-future history version of the United Kingdom in the 1990s, preceded by a nuclear war in the 1980s that devastated most of the rest of the world. The Nordic supremacist, neo-fascist, and outwardly Christo-fascist and homophobic fictional Norse Fire political party has exterminated its opponents in concentration camps and now rules the country as a police state. The comics follow the story's title character and protagonist, V, an anarchist revolutionary dressed in a Guy Fawkes mask, as he begins an elaborate and theatrical revolutionist campaign to kill his former captors, bring down the fascist state, and convince the people to abandon fascism in favor of anarchy, while inspiring a young woman, Evey Hammond, to be his protege. All right, that's a very bird's eye view of what goes on here. We got to talk about the Guy Fawkes connection here. The man, I don't know a lot about him. I know you told me you looked a little bit up, but he was a revolutionary who tried to burn down Parliament. I guess he was unsuccessful.
So I think what V is doing in the story is sort of reclaiming Guy Fawkes and the Guy Fawkes mask, because Guy Fawkes is sort of celebrated by Protestants as a failure, like the idea that he like attempted to do this stuff but was arrested and executed. But I'm going to read a little bit here. Guy Fawkes was a Catholic extremist in the early 1600s who conspired with others to assassinate King James I and other government leaders on the first day of Parliament. After his plan was thwarted, Protestants celebrated his arrest and execution. Later, Guy Fawkes Day on November 5th became part of the British Thanksgiving. V for Vendetta reinvents Guy Fawkes and presents him as a rogue hero who is a champion for human rights rather than the traitor he is remembered in history for being. The mask symbolizes V's belief that doing the right thing is not the same as following rules.
Yeah, and what a massive legacy this has now, and much of it popularized by this comic. This mask, you see it today. You see people wearing it. You have Anonymous, on the internet wears it. It shows up in protests around the world. It's been a piece of political movements. And a lot of it, I think, does tie into this idea of anarchy as a response to fascism.
Yeah. I do also want to say like how interesting it is to see anarchy when it's being led by someone, and how the pitfalls of what can happen with that, because it's still one person sort of influencing what he thinks is correct, which kind of reminds me of Rorschach. The idea that like ultimate justice for Rorschach means doing anything that's necessary, making sure like justice is always served, and V here is saying like anarchy, like destroy everything, but because he knows what's best, but who's to say he does? You know, that's sort of the...
Well, and I don't think he does know what's best. And so I saw this quote here that I thought was really telling for like the way Alan Moore and David Lloyd perceive V. And honestly, I could take this and apply it to Watchmen as well. So Alan Moore said, quote, "I didn't want to tell people what to think. I just wanted to tell people to think." I think that comes across here, right? Like, it doesn't present a lot of answers as much as it just is about tearing down and showing hypocrisy and you know, racism and oppression that happens against, you know, homosexual people and just anybody who's perceived as an other. And it seems like Alan Moore is trying to say, like, wake up and see this, see what is going on, and think about how we should combat it, without providing the answers, but saying, like, think about it.
And the idea that, like, people just need it in their minds to know that, like, whether or not you go along with it, just at least be aware of it. You know what I mean? Because, like, we make decisions every day that give up our privacy, that give up our how active we're being in a political sense, how much our voices are being heard, that sort of thing. But know that you're making a decision more than every day. Make sure that you're pushing against, you know what I mean, in every possible way.
Yeah. And man, that touches on something that I thought was incredibly prescient, was the surveillance. The idea of this constant surveillance by the government in the 80s, like early 80s, you know, and like how true that is today, you know? I mean, I know they weren't alone in predicting this sort of stuff, but I don't know. I thought it was really fascinating just to see it and how real. I mean, obviously, it's like they're putting in, you know, cassette tapes and stuff like that. It's got funny ways that it's very 80s, but man, it's still the ideas are there for like things that are going on right now.
And I mean, something that seems innocent, like social media, like you're posting pictures of your dog or going to do this, but the privacy and the access that you're giving to anybody who wants it, which includes the government, and the way that like it can seem like a fun thing, like watching TV in this story is sort of like you're giving up, you're not paying attention to anything, you're just watching whatever they tell you to. And this is all obviously like hugely propaganda related as well. Like they're putting, it's all state provided entertainment. And the way that like shutting your brain off and just watching that isn't thinking and challenging, but it's, you know, it's sneaky, you know, fascism is sneaky. And I think it's there before you know it.
The propaganda stuff, like, I mean, thinking about like Fox News and stuff, like it's wild to think. It's definitely trying to point out how the news is a trusted source, right? And so many people turn it on and think that it is unbiased and think that they're being told the truth. And then behind the scenes, we see that it is literally the mouthpiece of the government. It is a propaganda outfit through and through. Mm-hmm. And we see those agencies and those organizations existing today, not just in America, but all over the world. And, you know, can be the mouthpiece of fascism. And it is like an incredibly important piece of this this structure working. And so in this book, there's like, it's kind of described as like a body, and every position is linked to like a part of the body. So you have the head, you have the mouth, you have the eyes, you have the ears. And it's making up the body of this fascist state. And I thought like the metaphor was a little bit on the nose, but I ended up really liking it as a concept, because it really shows you how they're all important parts of making this thing go. And each piece is very important, and each piece has to be challenged to dismantle it.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. Like at first I was like, ooh, the ear, like that's kind of the things that I think of when I think of the nose and the ear. Yeah. It felt kind of cheesy a little bit, but like you said, as it went on, I bought in, and I was like, it's just, I mean, it's the 80s, and I think it makes sense for the time. And yeah, I like the way that they tackle each version and allow the reader to think about like things going on in their life. Like what are the ways that the government or anyone is trying to surveil me or control me? As simplified as that is, it's effective.
Okay, if you're ready, man, let's talk about book 1.
To start, Evey is an interesting character, right? Like her background, the way that she's setting up the world for us as the readers, to like her background informs the larger world that's been going on. And then the introduction of V as like sort of this vigilante Batman-esque person who has a secret lair that he takes her back to and all this stuff. There's a lot of things that I'll probably point out that are Batman-ish, but it's almost like Batman attacking, taking down fascism or something like that. And it's not one for one, obviously, but there are this sort of cloaked figure in the night. You know?
Some similarities are there. Yeah. So Evey is interesting. I can see why they changed this character significantly for the film. I think the idea was she was going to be this kind of blank slate character who V can mold. But because of that, I don't know. She feels underserviced as a character and cliche. She is constantly being sexualized. From the first moment we meet her, there's an attempted rape, and a lot of troubling stuff surrounding that, and how she's kind of dealt with throughout. She's 16, which, especially as an American, that's really weird to read about the 16-year-old in this sexualized way.
Well, I mean, even just it's tragic to think of a 16-year-old who's having to turn to basically prostitution just because of like the we come to find out that there's not resources from the government in any way for people.
Right.
That's the part of the division between
and her
upper
parents
class
were
and lower class.
Her father was disappeared and for being a socialist and all this stuff. So it's like she's been struggling under the heel of the state, which I think is very important. But yeah, so she gets brought in by V, and he takes interest in sort of teaching her the ways, and really over time molding her. We meet a lot of these government officials, of which there are many. We have like Derek Almond, who is the finger. We have the head, who is Adam Susan. Is in love with Fate, who's the supercomputer system.
I think that's also saying a lot about, because this person loves fascism, but fully believes in fascism, and this idea of like the analytical nature of the computer always providing the answers and everything always being cut and dry. Something about that I think there's a commentary being made there. I think a computer, typically people think a computer as being like void of. A computer that thinks on its own and has ideas and that kind of thing would be void of artists or void of art in general. And I wonder what's being said there. And, obviously that's not necessarily the case with computers now and everything. I think the first idea of a computer is that it's sort of the anti-art.
I see. Yeah, maybe. I liked how a lot of these characters are shown to be deeply sort of flawed, mentally unstable people. And, this guy, this leader is disturbed, right? Like his worldview is messed up and he's in charge of everything. You know what I mean? And like, as living in a time where our leader is severely mentally disturbed, it seems to me, I identified with that, even if it may be in slightly different ways. It's still like the idea of someone who can be so deranged yet still hold so much power. That really spoke to me.
And what's funny is I was thinking about this, obviously, because I have to relate it to what we're going through. And I felt like there was like a pity that I had for this character when he like spiraled and eventually like, was in love with the computer and just like there was no, but I don't feel any pity for our current, you know what I mean? There hasn't been the humanity that I think some of these characters have in our leadership. So it's like, I don't know, man.
Well, you know what? There's and we're getting ahead of ourselves, but I want to talk about it while we're on Susan here, Adam Susan. There was a part where he was driving, or he was in the car, and he thinks about how like I'm the only one who is real. And he starts like looking out at everybody and how they're all just like there to feed into his own ego and his own mind. And that one I felt like, ooh, that might really be speaking to something there. Yeah. this sort of solipsism in government and in leadership and having it all be about you. That sounds familiar. Anyway, we also meet Finch, who is the detective, which I actually really want to talk a lot about this because I thought it was really interesting to have this, like, he's maybe, other than Evey and V, Like the next character who gets the most attention is arguably Finch, and he's a cop. He is the part of the nose. And I thought it was interesting to position a detective as sort of a main cast character here, who is he's somewhat sympathetic throughout, in a book about fascism and about a police state, right? I think it's effective because, like, I think most people recognize that there are good people in policing, but how the system itself can be oppressive, and in the book it definitely is. So even though Finch seems to be a fairly good person, he's caught up in this, right? And his story is one of like what to do. What is a good person to do when you sort of realize that you're a piece of this monstrous system?
Right, and I like that you said that because his character, and he goes on to put himself in the shoes of the people who are actively against him in a very real way. You know what I mean? And try to empathize and go through what they're going through, which I think is, which makes him a character that is willing to question. That's what V is ultimately looking for, is people who are willing to raise questions and challenge status quos and things like that. And
think about what you're doing. Think about what you're like promoting through your work. Yeah.
And this character maybe is forced into it at one point, but eventually finds a way. And I'm not saying this character is really all that sympathetic. I think he's, a product of a system, and ultimately kind of has like a reevaluation of his own like role in it. But we'll get to it when he takes the LSD specifically.
So let's talk more about what happens in book one. In book one, we also have this priest, Bishop Anthony Lilliman, who's a pedophile, and Evey sort of infiltrates his bedroom, pretending to be a child prostitute. And so, I mean, this book goes places.
Something that I just watched Borat 2 recently, and I know it's been in the news like crazy.
Oh wow, yeah,
but
you're right.
This like totally reminded me of the Giuliani situation, where like
cow, yeah, I didn't even think about. I haven't seen it, but that's amazing. That's true. So anyway, and then feeding him a poisoned communion wafer, I thought was like so we're getting into a little bit of V as a character, but he poisons this guy with a communion wafer, and then I'll just finish out what else happens in book one. He also then kills this Dr. Surridge, who they all worked at this Lark Hill basically concentration camp where people were being executed, and we find out that V was prisoner 5, who was experimented on, and it seems like the medical experiments made him sort of schizophrenic and definitely messed with his mind, and sort of created or I don't know, amplified some of the like really elaborate thinking and planning and stuff that we see out of V that is almost supernatural in a way.
Right.
Some of that was amplified by these medical experiments that went down at this facility. And then he gets his revenge on her, although he's much gentler to her, letting her, basically he had already poisoned her when she wakes up, and then he lets her know, like, it's not going to be without pain and all this stuff. So very gently sort of takes her out, because apparently he has some feelings of I don't know, like maybe she went on to have a good life, it seems like, maybe after the fact, and so he's given her some benefit of the doubt for that.
And the way that she reacted when she saw him was like, I always knew you would come, I knew you were on your way. And yeah, maybe there was some sort of attempt to try to do better.
God, there's so much to talk about here. But like, so what does that say? It's like, if you've done these horrific things, but then you live the rest of your life trying to make it better, it's like you're not forgiven, but maybe like the punishment isn't as harsh, even though the result is the same. I don't know. It's like it's like you get something, but you don't get forgiven. So I thought that was interesting. But let's talk about V as a character, because after seeing the movie, that was, by the way, that was my only experience with this beforehand, is I'd seen the movie, I'd never read the comic. And I remember thinking like, that character, he's like so over the top. He's got such intricate plans for everything. It's unbelievable, right? Like that he could be like, at the same time he's planning this elaborate scheme, he's also like building big domino sets, and he's like creating an entire stage of believe, like photorealistic, like someone would be fooled recreation of something, like he does all this stuff and it's so over the top. But I felt like the comic does a slightly better job of explaining how that could happen. And it's still, you have to suspend your disbelief to believe it. But like I was able to do it better in the comic, I think, than the movie, at least from my memory of it.
If I remember correctly, I think that the book takes place over like a much larger amount of time, like
several
much
years
longer amount of time.
Like. Yeah.
And I think like that, given that he was killing a lot of these people behind the scenes before they were even realizing it, like they were like either disappearing or seemingly dying normal deaths and things like that. He'd been taking out the people that had affected him at Larkhill and taking out like people in this like hierarchy of the government that like are propagating some of this stuff. And then we get the idea that like he's been affected by this treatment and all this other shit that he's been put through. The way he speaks, I agree. Like it's very over the top, but it does serve the character well. Like it makes him an interesting character, and it makes him
theatrical.
I love the studying and the knowledge that would have gone on into a character like that, and the understanding of different philosophies and different forms of art and all that kind of stuff. That stuff always really speaks to me. The people who are like the keepers of knowledge or like protectors of knowledge in an apocalyptic scenario like this. It's to me, it's the important stuff. To sort of like show that culture was here and show that like art existed and that kind of thing. So very interesting, like well-read character, clearly, like very intelligent, and then made even more eccentric by the treatments and the way that he speaks and the way that he thinks, apparently.
And like some of this is like, it has to be this way for the character to work in the way that it does, like so that he can talk about like famous writers who have written about anarchy and written about fascism. And he can sort of be a mouthpiece for that and embody that in a way. It's like highly symbolic, and that is we'll get to that. That's dealt with directly in the text. So like the character kind of has to be this way to be as effective as he is in this role in this story. I love how like everything has like symbolic undertones, and you buy into the idea that this is all planned, right? Like the way that he kills this pedophile priest. It's really, really brilliant. And then he feeds him this poison communion wafer, and then he even says, like, I can't remember exactly, but it's something about like, this should be transformed into the body of Christ, and not kill you. But then it does. So it's like kind of proving that this guy is false, and that maybe his faith is false, but at the very least that like he is false, and that he doesn't actually have the power or the godliness that he pretends to have, directly proving that through the poisoning. I mean, I like that. I like the sort of takedown of that, especially the pedophile priest. It's not just religion, but it is religion because religion is a system that protects people like this historically. I wanted to talk a little bit about this too, because I think originally I would have balked at the idea that like everybody is so terrible in this government. But again, that has proven to be true, right? Like this sort of power and corrupt and racist, homophobic, xenophobic administrations, apparently they seem to attract the worst people. And so the idea that like every person that we uncover is like worse than the next in many ways, like I buy it, like the skeletons that must be in some closets. I think we're just starting to hear about some of the shit that's going to be coming out. Hopefully, if things go the way we want, because these are some evil people, and people make this point all the time on Twitter. Writers I see making this point all the time of like, I would be laughed out of the office if I showed this to my editor and I was like, this and this and this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen as a metaphor, and it's like that's way too on the nose, But then in American politics, like it's happening all the time. It's
crazy. It's crazy.
All right, so let's talk about book 2. This is called This Vicious Cabaret.
So this chapter starts with like a prelude, and you sent me a video on YouTube where someone because it's there's a musical like written. I don't know music very well, clearly, but basically they had written out the notes and the music on the paper next to the lyrics that V is singing.
Sheet music.
In the video, someone was performing the music and sort of reading off, and it was a really interesting experience because
cool. I'll put that in the show notes because it's really cool. I recommend you watch this, especially if you've ever read the comic and you haven't checked out something like this before. It's cool.
Yeah, it's cool because like that had to be written by Alan Moore, obviously collaborating with somebody. Or I mean, I guess maybe not. Obviously, maybe he does.
I don't know. Maybe he's a musician who knows how to do that himself.
But to see that on the page to be brought to life in this YouTube video is really cool. And it's sort of setting up all the stuff that's going to go on in this chapter, where V basically takes out multiple people in the mouth to sort of cripple the propaganda machine of the mouth, and then the finger, he's taking out some of like the people who go out and like, you know, threaten people, that kind of thing.
It's the hands of the state, the people who literally touch the people, you know. The metaphor is on the nose, but it works.
Right. So yeah, he's taking out all these people. We're just starting to see people vying for positions within the government, and like their own self-interests are becoming a part of this political machine, and kind of undermining it in ways, and also creating weaknesses, which V is able to sort of start toppling.
Before I just looked at my notes and saw something from book 1 that I wanted to mention. On page 2, the phrase "Make Britain Great Again" appears.
I saw that, yeah. I was like, holy shit. Did they take that from this book?
I don't know. But anyway, I had to say that.
I couldn't believe it, yeah.
Oh, the other thing I want to talk about before we get really more into the plot here. Overall, the way this book looks, the way it reads, I struggled a little bit to track characters. Now, I think if I was reading this issue by issue as it comes out, let's we talked about with Watchmen, versus like all in one like one go, like I basically did. I mean, it was multiple sittings, but you know what I mean. It was kind of difficult to visually differentiate between a lot of these like white dudes in government, especially. Even some of the women it was sometimes difficult to like visually tell who is being dealt with. There was also some stylistic choices, which I read a little bit about in the essay that follows in the book I have from Alan Moore, where he talks about how they made the decision to not have any sound effects, and then also not have thought bubbles. And because of that, there were times where it was hard. I don't know, the thought bubbles more than anything else, where it was hard to like identify who the like primary character was and what we're seeing, because we do sometimes get like exposition or what seems to be thoughts. I'm not really sure. So I just wanted to talk about it stylistically. That, you know, sometimes you get like jagged like things around stuff, which was supposed to be like loud sounds, or like the radio might be saying something, so that would be jagged. And then there was like boxy stuff, and then there was speech bubbles, and like sometimes I would have trouble immediately situating myself to like what I was reading and what it was. And I don't know if that's just like maybe I need to be like a higher level comics reader than I am currently, or if that's like they were really trying something experimental here and everybody might have had to kind of figure out what's going on. I don't know. Like, what was your take on that?
I think a little bit of both. I think like there's a certain confidence that they're definitely displaying, because it is, if you confuse people, they're gonna not want to keep reading, you know. And like, so to be like, I think we can visually tell this story. To, you know, have somebody in the foreground, or have somebody like clearly actionably doing something, and like you know, typically they try to put the text boxes like closer to the characters, so like there's a little bit of that, but also at the same time I think it is, I don't think you're supposed to blaze through this story, you know what I mean? Like especially as it's coming out, like you said, if this comes out and it's like 10 pages, and you went to the comic shop and bought it for 50 cents or $1 or whatever back in the 80s, you're not going to blow through it and then never look at it again. You're going to take your time and really marinate in it. And I think like that has something to do with it as well. And I think I just think that that's part of what this story is. It's supposed to be a slow burn.
Yeah, and then you mentioned before we got on that maybe because I said like I was having trouble telling some of these characters apart, and then you had mentioned maybe that was intentional, right?
Yeah, as far as the characters being similar, I agree. I was like, who is this guy? And as we get further along, we haven't seen certain characters for a while, so I forget what they looked like back then. And then it's also like the artist isn't 100% always going to draw the character exactly the same way, depending on the angle that they're standing or what they're doing. So yeah, for me, like there were times where I was like, who is this again? And what it like? But yeah, I mean, that was just me spitballing when I was talking to you about it, is maybe intentional. Maybe this robotic system was meant to have a ton of white people who were just in power. Yeah, white men.
Also, I think it's interesting to note that this was coming out in black and white originally. which would have made it even more difficult because sometimes a little bit of the color helped me. And I think it's interesting to note that this was one of the least popular pieces in those Warrior comics, is what I was reading. Like,
really?
And like people didn't like this.
Wow.
And the fact that it got picked back up and completed after the Warrior comics, I guess, went under or that line got canceled or whatever, is interesting, right? And then, of course, it's gone on to be one of the most, I saw that it was listed in like top 100 most influential comics of all time, stuff like that. It's like this iconic work. Yet at the time, I think people struggled with it. And I wonder if we're touching on some of it. Like maybe it was just a little bit off-putting, a little bit difficult to follow. And it's appearing aside other comics, which are probably much easier to grok, right? Whereas this is incredibly sort of complex and layered. And like I said, it lends itself to like really studying it. And not everybody wants to do that when they pick up a comic, I assume. And especially depending on the readership of that particular anthology series, right? Like, what is their readership like? Are they looking for something like this?
Yeah. The fact that it was canceled and picked back up without a huge sort of following, I just always assumed it had this massive following. Like you said, it other stuff around it that was in that anthology was probably easier to read. But also in terms of like pushing what comics were doing at the time, like I have a feeling that this was very much an outlier.
Well, this was early on in Alan Moore's career too, so he wasn't known for this sort of stuff. He was fairly new, I think. So yeah, I mean, obviously he builds up a reputation over time, builds up a readership. Anyway, I just wanted to be able to touch a little bit on some of the stylistic stuff. And then now let's get back into the plot.
One of the things that I always remember and I think makes this story, one of these crazy comics that is in the top 100 of all time, this all the stuff that goes on with Evey here and the way, this is the stuff that's always stuck in my mind because it's so brutal. And like Evey is so up to this point, this character that is like really two-dimensional, and to like put her through all of this.
So you're specifically talking about when he captures her and fools her into thinking she's being tortured and imprisoned, right?
Yeah, right. And just like how tortured as he was, and put through some of the same things that he was put through, like mentally tortured, physically tortured. And like to see her come out on the other side, and honestly, the biggest holy shit moment is the reveal of the letter that she'd been reading to sort of keep herself comforted and everything like that. Yeah. And then for her to come out, right, for her to come out the other side of all of this stuff that she went through and say like, V, I can't believe you came up with this letter. It's so touching. It feels so real. And he's like, no, that's how I made it through my prison and all the stuff that I had to go through. And that's my favorite moment, and like my favorite sort of section of this whole story, as problematic as it does feel for him to be like torturing this 16-year-old woman and all of that. Like that's obviously tough to read.
Yeah. Ethically, this part is incredibly difficult. He is abusing, this is against her will, you know what I mean? This is not consent. And he is, torturing somebody to teach him a lesson. And the thing that I struggled with is sort of more the aftermath of this scene, because like I believe that this character would do that. He is so like beyond like human concerns like this. Like it's all about building you into a better person and the person that I think you should be, and who is more able to sort of follow in my footsteps, which we know is like the eventual goal, I guess. But I felt like Evey forgave him maybe a little bit too fast, because I think the rage would and in fact I kind of wanted it to be unforgivable, and then maybe you just kind of find like a middle ground, whereas instead we get her, she basically completely forgives him right away, and that was a part where like the character note just didn't quite strike right for me, at least in my sensibilities. I felt like I don't know that you could ever forgive somebody for doing this to you, regardless of their intention.
Right.
That's just, I don't know, maybe this is how I feel.
I mean, and it's not even like V did it for her own, it's not for her. He doesn't do it for her. He kind of does it for her to realize these things, but he does it for him because of his ideals. Ultimately, it's not for her.
He's forcing his viewpoints in some ways onto her, right? Like,
Yeah,
he would argue that she is like arriving at the same conclusions, but like he's creating the circumstance for her to do that.
Right.
Like, I don't know, man. It's a weird part, but like you're right. It's one of the things that you'll remember about this story. It is incredibly memorable.
Another layer to it is that this is all done to him. You know, it's not like he doesn't understand what she's going through.
Exactly. Yeah.
I just, it's always stuck with me with this story, and like how he is becoming the same people, you know, in doing this to her, he's becoming the same people that he's fighting against. He's subjugating somebody. He's forcing them to do something against their will in this extreme of a circumstance too, in like a concentration camp environment.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit too about the sort of multi-year plan going on here. When we first meet V, he's blowing up Parliament. Which I believe happens much later in the movie. So this is the order of events is very different. And then in this book too, in particular, he is attacking this propaganda outfit, which we see is like has this like racist programming. I thought it was really interesting actually. It was like racist / like empty sexuality. It was like kind of going between the two. And it was intercutting. A lot of the structure of this is fascinating. The way it intercuts, I thought was great. And then like, I don't know, like what it's trying to say about like the role entertainment plays in propagating this stuff, right? And like how if you don't expect more from your artists and from your entertainment, you're gonna let yourself sort of be brainwashed into believing this shit. And I don't know. I think that's a really interesting point to make, and something that I do hear a lot of people still talking about today. And, you know, here's Alan Moore in the 80s talking about it. You know, interesting stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting to think of like what TV represented to this generation of people. You know, TV isn't the same today. You know, it was when we were kids. Sure. You know, TV, but TV was like, there was like, you know, this idea that everybody would be watching the same channels.
It was still like appointment television stuff, right? Like everybody's watching this stuff at the same time. It's not streaming like it is today. So like, yeah, getting like it's much more like a live event, like watching sports, but like everything was like that. You all, everybody tuned in at the same time to watch. Yeah.
Right. So, you know, you walk to the water cooler in the next morning at work, and you're like, did you catch the news last night? And everybody did. So it is even more so like homogenizing everyone to the same things. Whereas today, I think there is more diversity, but I still think that the sort of idea holds true of, you know, getting sucked into sort of mindless entertainment and what that can do for a fascist regime if that's all you care about.
Well, yeah, I think the sort of empty sexual stuff, I think was saying that, but then in particular the sort of racist. It was like a Western with this guy who was like fighting a bunch of like very problematic racist tropey characters, and he was this white blonde, you know, savior, and like, you know, I think it's like pointing out like, hey, maybe we should pay attention to what message is being told to us in some of this stuff.
Right. Well, in that same show, black people were like enemies and savages and like all this other, you know, like very clearly. So
I think they were like raping women and stuff. Like it was all the like worst tropes. Yeah, and like you know. That's saying something, that is what this propaganda outfit is putting out. It's like one of the most popular shows on television, you know? Anyway, so I wanted to talk a little bit about Allie here, Allie Harper. So he's this like, I don't know, he's like, he leads a bunch of thugs, and he's a thug himself, and he ends up killing this Gordon character who Evey shacks up with for a little while. And we get the introduction of this guy, and I hated reading him. It was the most brutal part of the entire book, and he talks a lot. I was amazed at how much this guy talks. It was written in a way that was trying to be phonetic, I guess, and spelling out what I guess is like a Scottish accent. And it was awful. It was so hard to read. And it was like, it just shows me how much I hate this kind of writing. This is something that like, I really don't think people should do. Like, I think we've all, I don't know. I hope that a lot of people recognize now that like less is more with this stuff. Like you can do a little bit here or there to sort of like hint at a Scottish accent. And you know, there's choices to be made about like how deep you want to go. But this was so over the top. Every single word was spelled differently to try and phonetically evoke the way Scottish people pronounce things. And it becomes almost unreadable. So, Yeah, this was a tough part for me, and I have to point it out. I really didn't like it.
I feel like Alan Moore, being British, he's more familiar with the accent. And maybe even reading it at the time more familiar with it. But yeah, as an American reader
but
now,
like we as Americans could write a British accent this way if we wanted to. If we wanted to really highlight how differently they pronounce everything, it's all about your perspective, right? And you're very locked into your view of like English and what sounds right to your ear. But instead, I don't read the rest of this comic with a British accent. I just read it how I read it. So, like, that's the lesson I think to learn here, is that, like, that's just your perspective on how someone else sounds. And it's always going to change versus, like, what your own accent is and how you pronounce things. And I don't know. Right. English is a weird language because so many people speak it in so many different sort of dialects and accents and stuff. So, like, I understand you wanting to evoke certain things. But again, less is more. You can do so much with just one little tweak here or there, a different word choice here or there, and you can bring up that accent in people's minds, and they can hear the character without making it so difficult to read.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like at the end of the day, like it didn't really add anything for me. So to lose it would have just made it easier to read. So
well, and it also I feel like it's almost dehumanizing in a way. It's almost like making fun of them. It's like, look at how ridiculous they are and the way they pronounce this. Like to me, that's where it starts to go. It starts to go into almost like an offensive territory.
I can see that,
which I don't like. Yeah. Like if you're Scottish and you're reading this, you're like, what? I don't what? I don't say this, because do you speak normally? So like, I don't know. It's bizarre. It's a bizarre choice. Didn't like it. And anyway, let's not linger on it too long, but I had to mention it. Okay. So just a couple more things here. I also really like the look of V in the comic. He's got this like really tall cap. And I don't know, like I feel like he was more imposing here than I remember him being in the film. I know we're not getting to the film yet, but this version of V was really interesting. And then I also really liked he was like playful, and he did this whole vaudeville thing where he like completely changed his look and even changed his mask. And I don't know, he just was he had a lot of character here that I really appreciated.
Yeah, to speak to like the movement of V in the some of the panels and stuff, like that's another sort of something that felt kind of Batman-ish to me is like, when he's almost turning into a specter as he runs away, and like the way the cloak is billowing and you can't really see his feet, and he's almost becoming something that he's like otherworldly, and the way that people were talking about how he was so fast and he would attack people so quickly, faster than a gun could get to him in some cases. I really liked a lot of the motion of this and like the look. I think as eccentric as he is in the movie, I think like you said, there's even more depth to it here. Like there's more range to like, I think he's less sort of human in a way, but more eccentric, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Like he's more performative, like you've said, theatrical. And then one of my favorite moments is when he references sympathy for the devil, when that's with the priest. He like sort of is like, please allow me to introduce myself. And then like the next panel, he has horns, and it was just like a quick moment of like him and he has horns on his mask, and it's just like, that's awesome. That's a cool reference to make. A lot of that stuff was really fun.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited to watch the movie just to like try and. It's been a while since I've seen it, and I want to refresh my memory. And then making a comparison, I think, between V in the film and V in the comics is going to be one of our primary comparison points, because I do feel like they're very different, and I'm struggling to put my finger on all the ways until I watch the movie. But let's move into book 3. So book 3 is called The Land of Do As You Please.
So yeah, here at the beginning, V continues blowing up buildings, this time taking out the ear's leader. So he's effectively taking out the eye, the ear, and the mouth. And because this is basically all the propaganda machines are down, people want to find something to do and realize that like their government isn't necessarily what it was before. And people start to get out in the streets and create riots and running all over the place and looting and that sort of thing. It's not peaceful, but no. it is the public taking action.
Yeah. It's interesting how it's sort of positioned as like a necessary step into the creation of this anarchist society that V seems to want. This land of do as you please, which I don't know, is a political concept of everybody going around and doing whatever they want. Does not seem sustainable to me. But I understand it's more of an ideal. I don't know.
I don't think it's supposed to be like exactly everybody do as they want.
It's very individualistic to me. That is the thing that always bothered me with that. It feels very libertarian in a sense. It's like it's all about you and what you want, and it doesn't take into account anyone else.
Right.
Sort of inherently.
Is that really how you want to live your life so selfishly? Yeah.
Yeah, it's very selfish, right? And if everybody goes around acting only in their own self-interest and only in the things that they want, I just don't think you can form a society that won't be oppressive inherently. Like, it's going to happen. It's going to descend into something terrible, if not even full-blown like Mad Max Fury Road type shit. It just...
The strongest sort of like, strongest take power and suppress people, that kind of thing.
So often, I think in sorry, this is just my own sort of soapbox moment, but I always feel like when we talk about these political ideas, they're all held up as like ideals of like, it's all this, it's all communism, it's all socialism, it's all capitalism, it's all fascism, it's all anarchy, right? And you're in a box. You're in one of these boxes. And, like, life isn't that simple. Like, every one of these, like, I mean, I don't know, debatably. But, you know, all of these ideas have something to them. There's something there of value. And, like, it's all about cobbling together something that makes sense and isn't too extreme. And I feel like anytime you go too extreme into any one thing, you can get in trouble. And I know that it sounds like I'm being a centrist in a way, and I'm not trying to say that at all, because I think that itself is a position that has its own drawbacks and its own pitfalls. But it's like, it's not all or nothing. You know what I mean? Like it's never all or nothing. And I don't know. It's about finding somewhere on the spectrum in between all of these opposing ideas that is equitable and will work for whatever society you're trying to make it work for, because everybody's different and every group of people is different. So I don't know. It feels like it's reductive to say that any one ideology got all the answers. And to me, it's setting yourself up for failure.
And that also creates so much division too, because people become so invested in one specific thing.
Yeah. And if you don't agree, you're the enemy.
Exactly.
So anyway, but here we are. We're talking about the way this book, proposes. And one of the things that I actually think is really interesting, though, is like, this is sort of an outline for what to do in a police state where the government is refusing to cede to the will of the majority, right? The will of the people. I don't know why I bring that up, but it seems like this could become something that could become a possible future scenario here. And it's interesting to look at this book as like, the majority of people do not have to be oppressed by a minority of people who are trying to rule by fiat, right? And rule just because they have the power and they are dominating you with that power. There is strength in numbers. There is strength in, and there are ways to oppose it and to dismantle it. And that could become important to know about.
Yeah,
possibly.
Definitely, man. It's scary stuff out there.
So anyway, back into what's going on here. Finch goes on a LSD trip. Yeah, which is really something. He takes 4, which like I don't know anything about LSD, but I assume you take one of them tablets, you're probably gonna have a trip. He takes 4 of them, and he's like, I don't know how much to take. Maybe I'll take all 4. I don't know. And then he like goes. He
loses himself like in this prison camp that they had.
Yeah. What a place to take it to. Like go to freaking a concentration camp and take LSD. Like probably not a good idea.
But will probably give you good perspective. Like whether it's a good or bad trip.
Yeah, and it does for him, I guess. He really empathizes with V. He gets into his headspace and I think this is the first time where he's really confronted with the horrors of the government and what has been going on. And I don't know, he actually even has a part where he talks about how he misses people that are no longer present in society.
There's a couple frames that I wanted to talk about here, actually, the couple panels. There's a panel where he's like saying that he misses like gay friends that he once had that he didn't mean to push away, and black friends and things like that. Yeah. And there's a panel that starts where you're seeing all this diverse group of people, and the exact same panel is the next panel, except all of them are like caricatures of of what, like, there was like a black stereotype, like offensive stereotype looking sort of in the vein of like what we saw in Lovecraft Country recently. Like, so I don't know
so
what that...
it's showing like the way that that society, the current society that he lives in wants him to perceive these people or something.
Yeah. And so it's just sort of like you said, like, yeah, the stereotype of what not being around these people and what this society, what this government has like forced into people's minds to otherize, to, you know, to make people see different people as other.
There's so much stuff like this that is so subtle and like really would lend itself, like you said, like to really studying these panels and like seeing what's being said here. So V also sort of positions himself to become a martyr for the cause, right? He allows Finch to kill him, and then he passes on the mantle to Evey, but in a way that lets her choose to take it up, right? Like, she doesn't even realize that he's doing that. And then I love the part where she is like thinking about unmasking him, and we see several different faces, and they're all just kind of like some dudes, some guys. And then she sees her father at one point too, because she thinks like, oh, maybe it's my father or something. But she chooses ultimately not to unmask him because it's like, anything I do is going to reduce him to being a man, whereas right now he's not a man, he's an idea, and ideas are bulletproof, which he says to Finch. And even though he's been killed, he lives on as an idea. Right.
When Finch, like, V and Finch meet in the Victoria Station, and then Finch like pulls his gun and fires a couple shots, and V's like, you can't hurt me, I'm an idea, I'm bulletproof, and then that's when he stabs Finch. And yeah, that idea comes back around. Another thing that I like is sort of in a meta way. It was, you know, you have to think like this comic was coming out for like a few years. And so like, if Alan Moore was to reveal anyone to be V, it would have been ultimately unfulfilling. So it's sort of a meta way of engaging with the reader as well and saying like, well, what did you want? Like, cause this is the better than anything you're going to get specifically.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting in that essay at the end of the book, I think it's called like Behind the Painted Smile or Behind the Painted Mask or something. He says at one point that he's not. He says the only thing I can tell you is that he's not Evie's father.
Yeah,
it was interesting that he came out and said that.
Yeah, because that's too plain. Like that's way too plain for Alan Moore. Like that's so typical of a story like this.
Right. You know, obviously he becomes a father figure for her, but he is not actually her father. And yeah, so just getting back on the idea of like V as an idea, as a concept, as a symbol, that's what gives him the power he has, right? Like that's what imbues, you know, so many things in comics and especially superhero stories, which this kind of is. You know, superheroes get imbued with some sort of power through some means, right? It's a scientific experiment, and that kind of happens here too a little bit. But you know, Krypton for Superman, right? Like gives the power of the sun or whatever. Like he's an alien. There's all these different like origin stories and stuff. But like at his heart, V is empowered by his ideas, and he is empowered by the symbol that he represents of the people fighting back against fascism and against a police state and this kind of stuff. And that seems unique to me, like the idea of a superhero whose power is drawn from the power of his principles, and that's cool stuff, and that's what I think V is. Definitely,
I mean that's like part of what makes this character so. I think a character who stands so much by their beliefs that they're willing to die for it too reminds me of Rorschach again. Like might not be the right sort of the right path, but it's his path, and he believes in it so fully that he'll go to the end, feeling that way, because ultimately, Rorschach dies in a similar way, in a way that's like, standing by his convictions, and then
to the bitter end.
And then we have V here, who, and I do think like I said, the influence I think from the story is pretty massive too, because there's other, like, even if you think of like the Dark Knight, like other versions of Batman, later versions of Batman, like at the end of the Dark Knight, it's like he's a symbol, right? He's a symbol, like
talking about the film The Dark Knight.
The film The Dark Knight, yeah. So when at the end, like he is a symbol. He represents like he's there for people to hate. He's there for people to love, but he ultimately is like he's going to stand for justice or whatever.
He's no longer a person at that point.
Right. He's a symbol. in the same kind of way. And I think, I'm not going to say that influence was directly from Alan Moore in 1982 or whatever from V for Vendetta, but he could have popularized it in a way. I don't know.
Could be. Yeah, I like that. It does fit V to sort of orchestrate his own demise in a way. Like, it feels like it's all planned in a way that would almost be unbelievable if you haven't seen him pull off all these other plans that are unbelievable. You're like, okay, I guess this is the way he always wanted it to go down, because he clearly chooses to let Finch shoot him. Like, he could have killed him without drawing attention to himself.
I think he had his back turned. Yeah, like Finch had his back turned.
Finch even points it out later. Like, I don't know why he let me shoot him, because he could have done something to stop it. And it's because he wanted this moment to empower Evey to become him. And then she does, and she appears as V to talk to the people and inspires an insurrection to sort of kick off. But the focus is on her, right? And her journey, right? And then she picks up this dominant character, and it seems to me that she is going to begin training him in much the same way that V trained her, and pass it on like person to person, which I thought was interesting. It was very personal, like really influencing one person to take on the role. I don't know.
Yeah, I had a question actually with all this. Because throughout the story, Evey had been against killing. She was like, I'm not going to help you kill anymore. I'm not going to kill for you. Yeah. And I wonder if this is V as the killer. Like he's incited this anarchy, and we've talked about the 2 steps where it's like you destroy it all and then you build it up. And he's doing the same thing that everyone he's going against is doing, killing people, suppressing people. And I just wonder if this is like him dying is him passing on to the next, like he can't exist in that society where he's killed all these people. He can't be a part of the rebuilding because he's the destruction. Like when he dies, does Evey taking on V, does that mean that she will now sort of be the building back up and ensuring that the fascist regime doesn't build up before this new society builds back up? Is she going to do it with less violence, with less killing? I don't know. I wonder if you felt there was something there too.
Maybe. I mean, I think there's room for her to behave differently, but the way she takes on the mask to me feels like she's following in his footsteps. I do think you're touching on something that I found really interesting, and it was the idea that like the people here of Britain, I don't think are shown to have definitely changed the way they think. And I think we're left with ambiguity of whether or not they will rebuild in a way that isn't just as bad and won't necessarily allow another fascist regime to take place. It's like he's trying to get people to wake up and think, but we don't necessarily see evidence that is taking place. So it feels more like ambiguous of like, if you do this again, there needs to be another V to come and take it down again. And that was kind of where I was thinking that she was positioning herself as like, if and it was almost like assuming that I will be needed again. Like V will be needed again, and I'll be here to take it down if it happens again. I don't know.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, because
it's like a pessimistic way of looking at things, which I think Alan Moore in the essay was saying that he and David Lloyd are both very politically pessimistic, and so I think that's coming through here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense too, because like even I think be optimistic enough to think that Britain can rebuild and create a better society, but also be pessimistic to know that like if they don't, V is here and we'll take care of it again.
Well, I think hopefully. It also like it's a good reminder that the reason that these fascist regimes can get into places of power is that enough people support them. Now it might be a minority, but there's still enough people out there who support it. It's that these movements are created by people, created by citizens for the most part of whatever country. And so it's a cautionary tale in that sense too of like, you can like, just because you topple one doesn't mean you're not going to replace it with another that's just as bad or worse. And you have to be aware of what you're creating and what you're promoting. And I think the book V for Vendetta really doesn't want to like let Britain off the hook for what they've created themselves. It's like they were complicit in this. And the people here, many of them actively participated in their own, and of course, often this is also the people who are left after this like ethnic cleansing that happened that horribly murdered all these people, right? Like, so the ones left behind, it's like, you're not necessarily forgiven for what you've done here. And I think that's why he didn't Alan Moore didn't seem to want to forgive everybody and be like, "Ooh yeah, kumbaya moment at the end here." It's like, no, the city's burning. There's rampant rioting and looting going on, and stuff's chaos, and evil shit's happening. And it seems like, I don't know that the result of this is necessarily a better world, but it has brought down something that was obviously bad.
Well, it's like they did something.
Yeah.
They didn't sit by and do nothing.
All right, so we're going to end here. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know in the form of a rating review. Oh, and make sure to vote. This is obviously a time where you're going to be hearing it from everybody. And I just know that there are some people who are on the fence about whether or not to vote at all, because you might be feeling like it doesn't matter. But I think it does matter. And I think this book is sort of a cautionary tale about if things go bad enough, then something like this could become necessary. And voting is one of the ways to ensure that, or to try and combat it in a way that can try and prevent it from getting this bad.
We just finished talking about apathy and not doing anything and what that can do. And this is your way to do something.
Don't be complicit, right? Yeah, don't be complicit. Exactly. And not voting is a way of doing that, in my opinion. Okay, but yes, we were going to be back next week with the film, and I'm very excited. It's kind of continuing the coverage, but also to dig into more of these ideas, look at the differences. Oh, also, there was no big long. One of the things I remember about the movie was there's this big long speech where every word started with the letter V. That doesn't happen in the comic, so I thought that was interesting. That's a movie edition. Certain things like that, I'm going to be on the lookout for, changes like that. So it'll be fascinating to get into. Looking forward to that.
If you wanted to support the podcast another way, we are on Patreon, patreon.com/ink2film. We have many different tiers, but the main one I would say is the $2 tier, where we those people in that Patreon tier get our bonus episodes every month. Typically we do something that's sort of adaptation adjacent or something related to the podcast that we've already covered in some way, but there are some different sort of topics on there as well. We have a lot of fun with that. There's close to 30 of them now. And
another one will be coming out very soon.
Another one's coming out very soon. There's other tiers all the way up to, $10, $25, and they get you different things. So if you're interested, look into that.
Also, make sure to connect with us on social media. We're at Ink2Film on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And we'd love to have you follow us and talk with us, interact with us. We like hearing from people who listen to the show. Absolutely.
Thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right. Happy Halloween, everybody. We will be back next week. Stay safe out there. Hopefully nothing too insane happens over the next 2 weeks, but just in case it does, think about V. Think about V for Vendetta.
Yeah. Stay safe, everyone.
Yeah. Until next time.
Thanks for listening.